Hello everyone, I am the Meta Kirby, and welcome to my channel, The Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews under the deck text. On this 7th season premiere of The Brewery, I will be discussing my take on a commander I possess in real life, Brudiclad Telchor Engineer. If you like this deck or any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. The best way you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. For just $1, patrons get early access to certain videos on YouTube. You can also support my channel for free by simply liking, subscribing, and sharing, which also helps out a lot. You can join my Discord server for free if you want to join the Commander Tavern community. All pertinent links are down in the description. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Brudiclad is a 4/4 legendary artifact creature artificer for 4 generic, 1 blue and 1 red. It is a bit hefty to cast for a non-green commander, so you'll definitely need plenty of mana rocks to get it out, as well as interaction to protect it, so as to avoid having to recast it multiple times from the command zone. That being said, while I do wish it was also green, as it is, Brudiclad is a very different and interesting commander due to its abilities. It's a token lord that gives haste to all creature tokens you control, but that's just a bonus. Its main ability creates a 2/1 blue Myr artifact creature token at the beginning of your combat step, but then you can turn all of your tokens into a copy of any token you control. Yes, this is not limited to creature tokens, so any clues, food, treasures, etc. you have can all become copies of any other huge beater you have. Since they have haste, you can then swing in for a ton of damage. Thus, the possibilities for building a Brudiclad deck are truly limitless. Thus, I will limit this deck tech video to showcasing my own build and the reasoning behind my choices. So know that this is in no way the most optimal, efficient, or only way of building Brudiclad. All I know is I have no idea what Broody is, but he seems to be clad in it. When I first saw Brudiclad, I immediately decided to build a janky meme deck. I wanted to copy and clone as many pet cards as I could think of, especially cards with a lot of mathematics involved. However, while not impossible, it's not as easy to generate a ton of tokens in blue and red as it is in white and green. That being said, restriction breeds creativity, so I went full blown into copying as many meme-worthy creatures as I could. But in order to do so, I need to be able to create token copies. The deck has gone through major changes since its inception due to all of the new sets released since then. But as I mentioned earlier, there are infinitely many ways to build a fun and amazing Brudiclad deck. Feldon of the Third Path, Hijinxes Mirror Breaker, and Saheeli Rai are a good starting point. Feldon is limited only to creatures in your graveyard, but at least, thanks to Feldon, just because one of your creatures got destroyed, milled away, discarded, etc., doesn't mean you'll no longer have access to it. You simply have to sacrifice a token at the beginning of the next end step. But with Brudiclad changing all of your tokens into copies of any token you include, it'll already have done its job. If you do change all of your tokens into copies of that one, the copies don't have to be sacrificed at the end step, just the original. Same goes with the token copies created by Hijinxes and Saheeli Rai. Only the originals are lost at the beginning of the next end step, but not the ones that turn into copies of it thanks to Brudiclad. Saheeli also has the added bonus of being able to create a token copy of an artifact we control, which is completely busted as well. Brudiclad isn't limited to affecting creature tokens, so we can turn all of our tokens into a very powerful artifact if we want to multiply its effect. Her other abilities are useful too, but she's mostly used to consistently create a token copy of any of our creatures or artifacts. Hijinxes is potentially the best of these three and can very easily be degenerate, but I chose to use it just to create copy tokens of creatures at instant speed. But you can very easily include something like Combat Celebrant in the deck. Not only does Combat Celebrant go infinite with Hijinxes, but it also goes infinite with Brudiclad, assuming you made a token copy of it first. Since Brudiclad triggers at the beginning of each combat step, creating a Myr that'll now become another copy of the Combat Celebrant copy, just exert the newest copy to get an extra combat step. Then Brudiclad creates another Myr that you'll turn into a copy of the Combat Celebrant copy. Then exert that new copy. Since you'll still have an unused token copy, even if the ones you exert are blocked and killed, you still get the additional combat step and thus another Myr that'll become a copy of the Combat Celebrant copy token that you're not attacking with. And thus you'll get infinite combat steps leading to eventual infinite damage. I used to include this card in my deck but have recently taken it out to make the deck even more casual. But if you want to have something a bit more consistent, then you can definitely add Combat Celebrant in the deck as well, since it works with or without Hijinxes and is a great creature to make multiple copies of. Going back to creating token copies of stuff, Mirror Pool can also create a token copy of any creature you control, as well as copying any instant or sorcery we control. So while it's mostly used to create a token copy of any of our creatures, it can also be used to copy any instant or sorcery we control on the stack. And best of all, it's on a mana producing land, so it doesn't take up a slot in the deck. Flame Shadow Conjuring is similar to the previously mentioned cards since the token is lost at the beginning of the next end step. However, unlike these past cards, you can't activate it whenever you want. It has to be when it triggers with the creature entering the battlefield. That being said, paying an extra red mana whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control to create a token copy of it is negligible in this deck. You're able to copy your creatures for just 1 red mana, and then you can change all of your tokens into copies of that creature before it goes away, so it's still amazing here. Helm of the Host is similar in that it's not activated when you want, but it triggers for free at the beginning of your combat step. That being said, this equipment is potentially one of my favorite cards in the deck. That's because the token created isn't legendary. So if you equip Brudiclad with it, then it creates a non-legendary token copy of itself. If you're able to, then you have some insane interactions coming up next. You're going to have 2 triggers on the stack, the Helm and Brudiclad. Have the Helm resolve first, creating the non-legendary copy of Brudiclad. Then have Brudiclad's trigger resolve. It creates the Mir, and then you can change all of your tokens into any token you control, in this case, the non-legendary Brudiclad. This becomes absolutely insane if they survive until your next combat step, so save your interaction to protect your board state. Let's say you do and you have something similar to this. If you have something like 4 copies of Brudiclad, 3 non-legendary copies, and the original equipped with the Helm of the Host, they will all trigger, so the Helm creates yet another copy of Brudiclad. However, due to timing, that newly created Brudiclad will not create the Mir token since the trigger already passed. However, the 4 Brudiclad already on the battlefield do trigger since they existed when the combat step began. So they're going to each create a 2/1 Mir token, which you're going to turn into more Brudiclad copies. You now have a total of 9 copies of Brudiclad. Essentially, the formula for knowing how many copies of Brudiclad you'll have on the board with just this interaction is 2n plus 1, where n is how many copies of Brudiclad you had before the combat step. Naturally, if you create more tokens of anything else before then, you'll have way more copies of Brudiclad in your combat step. But this formula is just for Helm of the Host being equipped to Brudiclad and you having no other ways of creating tokens until then. You also don't need to use Helm of the Host just for Brudiclad. You can also use it to create a token copy of any of your creatures. But once you get it, the best creature to equip to it is Brudiclad, or Kiki-Jiki. Keep in mind that Kiki-Jiki can't copy legendary creatures, but the tokens created by the Helm are not legendary, so you can then use the Kiki-Jiki clone to create a copy of itself. Then that copy can create a copy of itself, etc. So you can end up with infinite copies of Kiki-Jiki at instant speed. Use at the beginning of the end step of your opponent's turn, and you have infinite attackers at your next combat step. Twin Flame, Quasi-Duplicate, and Replication Technique also function to create token copies of creatures we control. Twin Flame has the potential of creating more tokens if you pay 3 more for each target beyond the first, so it's a good mana sink to get more token copies. If you copy different creatures though, they will all become just 1 token if you use Brudiclad, so keep that in mind. Quasi-Duplicate has the potential of being used a second time thanks to having Jumpstart. Replication Technique is very costly in comparison, but that's because it can copy any permanent we control, so we can copy a land or an enchantment if we wanted to. Not only that, but since it has Demonstrate, you can create 2 copies instead if you have your opponent copy Replication Technique. So if you have an opponent with very few things to take advantage of it, definitely go for it. The more the merrier. Heat Shimmer and Mimic Vat can also create creature token copies, but aren't necessarily limited to our own things like every other effect shown so far. They can also be used to potentially copy any creature on the board, not just ours. Granted, Mimic Vat can only do so by imprinting the creature when it dies, but you can then create a token copy of that imprinted creature for just 3 mana and tapping. So if someone killed something super powerful controlled by any other player, you can now copy it and then turn all of your tokens into copies of that. Fairy Artisans and Hate Mirage are also useful at copying opponents' creatures, but are only limited to copying opponents' creatures. Hate Mirage can create a copy of 2 different creatures, so they'll all inevitably become one single thing if you use Brudiclad afterwards. If not, then you can keep your 2 copies of those specific creatures. Fairy Artisans is an amazing creature for Brudiclad since it creates the token copy with 0 effort. Once the creatures enter the battlefield, you can create a token copy of it. You do lose any other copy created with it, but you'll always keep the most recent one. So you can potentially copy your opponent's best creature if it was the most recently played, and then turn all of your tokens into that. The tokens created are also artifacts, which synergizes amazingly well with the deck since artifacts matter here. Mystic Reflection, to a certain extent, is the last copying effect in the deck. Let's say you don't have any copy token creating effects, but you have a spicy creature you want to copy. Well, in response to Brudiclad's trigger, cast Mystic Reflection. Then the Mir token enters the battlefield as a copy of the chosen creature. Since it's a token, it counts for Brudiclad's ability. You can then change all of your tokens into copies of whatever the Mir token became. So not only that, but you can also use Mystic Reflection proactively. You can use it to respond to an opponent's creature being cast while it's on the stack to have it enter the battlefield as a copy of something else, thus taking away its enter the battlefield trigger if it had one. Alright, now that we saw how we can copy the best things on the board, we can't overwhelm the table if Brudiclad is the only source of token production. That's why the deck also has ways of creating large amounts of random tokens that will then transform into the best thing or most useful thing when Brudiclad's ability triggers. Snake Basket, Tempt with Vengeance, and Notorious Throng have the potential of creating a ton of tokens. The first two can only be used at sorcery speed but are amazing mana sinks. Once the deck gets going, you can potentially make huge amounts of mana by copying mana rocks, lands, or tokens like gold and treasures. However, copying mana rocks or lands means more mana that can be sunk into these effects, and then you can change all of those tokens, creatures and mana rocks alike, which is almost double the amount you have, into your best token. Notorious Throng isn't a mana sink, but it has the potential of creating an insane amount of fairy tokens for just 4 mana. If you have a ton of tokens going through, you're going to be dealing a ton of damage, so resolving this afterwards is just brutal. You can also potentially cast it for its prowl cost and get an extra turn. It is possible since the deck does have at least one rogue that can stick around, but we'll see what it is later on. Treasure Vault and Dockside Extortionist also have the potential of creating a huge amount of treasure tokens in one go. Not only can these tokens be used by Brudiclad to become copies of a threat and overtake the board, but they can also just be used as mana acceleration when needed. Remember that the deck isn't black nor green, so it needs all the help it can get in mana production. That being said, when piloting the deck, the potential for huge bursts of mana is pretty common. As a bonus, the Vault is also an artifact, meaning that it itself can be copied as well if we copy an artifact, so it also functions as a clonable land. Same with the other artifacts lands, but we'll see those later on. Skyclave Relic, Diamond Kaleidoscope, and Curse of Opulence also create tokens that can be used to accelerate our mana production as well as providing tokens, so they also serve a dual function. The Relic has to be kicked in order to get the tokens, but paying 6 mana to get 3 indestructible mana rocks for any color is quite the deal. You can then turn all of your tokens into copies of it, and then have a huge surge in mana that'll survive mass artifact hate spells like an Overloaded Vandal Blast, Bane of Progress, etc. The best thing about the gold tokens created by the curse is that they don't need to be tapped to sacrifice, which can potentially give us double mana if we have Urza out, but we'll see him in a bit. The Kaleidoscope is a pet card since I remember cracking this in a Visions pack back in the day when I was still a lad. It's not the most efficient way of generating mana, but I like it, and it can still be used to get a pseudo treasure effect. All you need is one of them anyways to have Brudiclad change all of your tokens into it. It can also be used to create a chump blocker in a pinch as well, which many opponents tend to overlook. Unexpected Windfall, Pirate's Pillage, and Seize the Spoils also perform a dual function since they not only draw us cards by looting but also create treasure tokens. These tokens can be used in a pinch if we need the mana right away or as a sort of rebate when casting these spells, but more importantly can either be copied by Brudiclad to get even more treasure or be used as tokens that will become a copy of something better. Field of the Dead, Kirkkeep, and Dwarven Mine also serve a dual function since they're mana producing lands that can create tokens so they don't even take up a slot in the deck. While Dwarven Mine will only create the Dwarf token if it enters untapped, the deck has plenty of mountain type lands so it shouldn't be an issue. In any case, since the deck is running all 7 fetch lands, you can use 4 of them to fetch for Dwarven Mine when conditions are met and you really need that token. You can even do this at instant speed to get a surprise chump blocker for that pro gamer move. Kirkkeep can do the same by creating a Kobolds of Kirkkeep token at instant speed for 2 mana and tapping. This one is more under your control though since both the Mine and Field of the Dead create them by triggers. However, in order to guarantee Field of the Dead triggering, this deck has only 1 copy of each land in it, so the deck is 100% singleton. Some amazing interactions you can do with these lands is thanks to replication technique. If you create a copy of Field of the Dead, then you can turn all of your tokens into copies of it. Then, when the condition is met, each time a land enters the battlefield, you'll get that many zombie tokens. Tokens that can then become either more copies of Field of the Dead or something else. Academy Manufactor, the final card in this section, isn't necessarily a token production in the deck since it doesn't create any tokens of its own. So this is yet another pet card in the deck. In fact, I took out Combat Celebrant to make space for it. The reason for that is because I love this card, but it doesn't do nothing in the deck. There are currently 6 cards in the deck that create tokens. While that might seem too low to warrant including it, keep in mind that when I do create treasure tokens, this will create thrice that many tokens in terms of treasures, clues, and food. More tokens that Brudiclad can take advantage of. And if you create a token copy of Academy Manufactor, then you can change all of those tokens into copies of it and really go to town. Then each time you create a treasure token, you're exponentially creating tokens in base 3, essentially triplicating your tokens each time thanks to Brudiclad. So if you love math and you love keeping it legit, Academy Manufactor provides some nice mini games where you gotta solve math problems within your commander games. As for the other pet cards in the deck, Those are the main things I want to copy with Brudiclad. You can definitely build a Brudiclad deck with the best interaction, most efficient mana acceleration, and then absolute bombs to replicate and smash face with. However, I wanted to use my deck as a home for those cards that are duds elsewhere but amazing here. Not only does it make the deck fun to play, but fun to play against as well. So why create multiple copies of Blightsteel Colossus when you can create multiple copies of 7 Dwarves or Brothers Yamazaki instead? Each of these creatures are allured for other creatures with its same name. So while there's only one copy of 7 Dwarves in the deck, if you're able to clone it once, then you can turn all of your tokens into copies of it. Then each creature you control named 7 Dwarves is going to have power and toughness equal to n+1, where n is the number of 7 Dwarves you have on the battlefield. So if you have 10 of them, each one will be 1111, which is nothing to scoff at, especially when the tokens have haste thanks to Brudiclad. I'm pretty sure that 110 power on the board is pretty scary. With Brothers Yamazaki, you only get one additional copy that won't go away due to the legend rule. However, by passing the legend rule, if you're able to copy them like with 7 Dwarves, then each copy will have a power of 2n and toughness of 2n-1, where n is the number of Brothers Yamazaki you have in play. As for being able to have multiple copies of them, the deck's running Sakashima of 1,000 Faces and Mirror Gallery. Not only are these useful at allowing Brothers Yamazaki to be more than just twins, but it also allows us to clone Brudiclad without Helm of the Host, which is ineffably useful. Having Sakashima enter as a copy of Brudiclad is also a great way to have a backup Brudiclad while also creating an additional 2/1 Mer token each combat step. Going back to busted creatures to copy, Urza Lord High Artificer and Urza Saga aren't necessarily those creatures, but they create a token of that creature. The construct each of these create is one of the best tokens for this deck. It gets +1/+1 for each artifact in play, which, as I mentioned earlier, artifacts are a very important sub-theme of the deck as well. These constructs become ridiculously big and can end games very quickly. Even if you had no other artifact on the board, they themselves are artifacts, so they pump each other. So even if they're the only artifacts on board, they'll each be NN, where N is the amount of these constructs you control. While Urza is a super powerful card and obviously not a pet card, he's used in the deck mostly as a way to get this construct while also turning the artifacts into mana rocks. The deck does need as much mana as it can generate since the commander is so expensive. So we need mana enough to cast it and protect it. Very rarely do I activate his ability since I can potentially whiff or reveal a counterspell, thus making me lose it. Remember the gold tokens created by Curse of Opulence? Since they don't need to tap to sacrifice like treasure tokens do, we can tap them for blue thanks to Urza and then sacrifice them for mana of any color, thus giving us 2 mana each. So Urza isn't here to break the game, but to accelerate my mana and give me an epic beater. The Saga can also be used to get any 0-drop or 1-drop mana rock in the deck to further accelerate our mana, so it also serves a double function here. Miss Syndicate Naga and Spawning Kraken are some more pet cards in the deck. Both of these creatures create tokens when dealing combat damage. The Naga Ninja in particular is amazing because it creates a token copy of itself, thus exponentially increasing the amount of tokens we get. Since it has ninjutsu, it can be surprised onto the battlefield and thus get a token copy of it. Then with Brudiclad, if we turn all of our tokens into copies of it, then each time we connect with those tokens, they duplicate. So you guessed it, some more mid-game math problems. Spawning Kraken creates the 9/9 blue Kraken whenever a Kraken, Leviathan, Octopus, or Serpent deals damage, but it's the only creature in the deck with any of those types. However, since it will create a Kraken when it itself connects, then those future Krakens will then create more 9/9 Krakens, thus being more like Miss Syndicate Naga. These creature tokens can very easily overwhelm the board when not dealt with. Reform is another pet card for this deck. It only creates tokens when it dies, but if you suspect a board wipe, you can have all of your tokens become copies of Reform if you manage to create a token copy of it. So opponents will either think twice about wiping the board, or if they do, then chances are you'll be the only one with creatures on the board. The best thing about this is that you'll have a bunch of 3/3 fish that'll then become 6/6 whales if someone wipes the board again. Then those whales become 9/9 Krakens, so you'll be able to survive 3 straight board wipes with it. I love it. Yuan-Ti Malison is another pet card in the deck because it's the only venture card worth including here, in my experience and opinion. Whenever it connects, you get to venture in the dungeon. This might seem like a very slow way to complete dungeons if not for the fact that you can clone it indefinitely many times. If you create but a single clone token of it, then you can turn all of your tokens into copies of it. Granted, they won't be unblockable if you attack with a wave of them, but attacking with a wave of them means that inevitably a lot of them are going to get through. If you constantly venture into Lost Mine of Fandelver, then you can scry one, then create a treasure token, which is super important for the deck, or even just the 1/1 Goblin since it's also a token, but the treasure is the best in this case. Then go through Dark Pool to drain each opponent for 1, then end at Temple of Dumathoin to draw a card. Again, not the fastest way to go about ending your enemies, but I love the venture mechanic, and adventuring through each room in Lost Mine of Foundelver is useful for the deck and its game plan, especially if you're able to complete it multiple times in a turn. Yuan-Ti Masen is also a rogue, so it can help you be able to pay prowl costs. Coat of Arms is included because it'll turn any of your creatures into something similar to Seven Dwarves, Brothers Yamazaki, and the Urza Construct tokens. This card is crazy good here. It's not as amazing as in a tribal deck, so make sure you don't cast it when facing off against tribal decks. But if you have a bunch of tokens that are copies of each other, then they'll obviously have the same creature type, and Coat of Arms will make them huge. Bonus points with going all out and getting this on the board with Seven Dwarves. The final cards I love copying with the deck are the Artifact lands: Great Furnace, Seat of the Synod, Darksteel Citadel, Power Depot, and Silver Bluff Bridge. Recall that I already mentioned Treasure Vault. Not only do these help in keeping the land base singleton in the deck for Field of the Dead, but if we're able to copy an artifact, we can choose to copy these. The great thing about cloning these is if an opponent overloads a Cyclonic Rift, we don't lose them. Plus, we'll have a huge surge in mana production when Brudiclad activates. The best of these to copy are obviously the indestructible ones, but they're all good in their own right, especially with the artifact synergy of the deck, which we'll still see some more of soon. Granted, half of the artifact lands in the deck are lands that are susceptible to artifact destruction, but it's a risk I'm willing to take due to the advantages they present in the deck. The following cards in the deck are the essential card advantage, responses, and mana acceleration of any deck. In terms of interaction, Wandering Archaic and Tidal Barracuda are amazing here. The Archaic is one of my favorite cards to come along in a long time, along with Academy Manufactor. Not only does it allow us to copy any spell an opponent won't pay 2 extra for, but if they want to cast any counterspell on any of our spells, they need to pay 2 extra, or else we'll just copy their counterspell and counter it with ours. However, if we clone it and then use Brudiclad to turn our tokens into copies of it, then opponents will have to pay a ton of mana for each spell they cast that they don't want us to copy. With a board full of copies of Wandering Archaic, then any counterspell opponents want to use against us will literally be too expensive to successfully cast. This card is so good here that I never use its backside. The Barracuda has a similar function in that it protects our turn from interaction since opponents can't cast anything during our turn. On top of that, it allows us to cast our own spells with flash, so we can keep our mana open for interaction, and if we didn't need to use it, we can save that mana to cast things at the beginning of the end step before our turn. Lazotep Plating is one of the synergistic protective spells in the deck since it gives all of our permanents and ourselves hexproof as well as providing a creature token. This card is just crazy good here and a lot of times overlooked. Naturally, Pact of Negation, Fierce Guardianship, Swan Song, Negate, Mana Drain, and Counterspell are included as much more solid ways of protecting our board state, but Lazotep Plating is just as good, at least from targeted removal, plus we get the token. This Counterspell suite is pretty self-explanatory, so let's move on. Champion's Helm, Swiftfoot Boots, and Giant's Amulet are also pretty self-explanatory includes since they protect our commander. However, I opted out of any effects that give Shroud since I want to be able to target Brudiclad in case I'm able to copy it with any targeted spell or effect. The Giant's Amulet is perhaps the best one here since we have the option to also get a token out of it for paying it a bit more when it enters the battlefield. In any case, 1 mana to cast and then 2 to equip to give hexproof is an amazing equipment regardless. Cyclonic Rift is another quintessential response in a blue deck, so its inclusion is pretty self-explanatory, especially in an aggro deck like this one since it can also be used offensively. Mystic Sanctuary is a way for us to recycle not only our responses but our copy spells by top decking them when it enters the battlefield untapped. Since it has the island subtype, it can also be fetched for with 4 out of the 7 fetch lands previously mentioned. You can also do this at instant speed in response to draw step in order to get that spell in your hand in an efficient and sneaky manner. As for drawing cards, the deck's running Curiosity Crafter. This creature is ridiculous here. Each time we connect with a creature token, we draw a card. However, since it's a creature itself, if we clone it, then that effect triggers for each copy we have of it. So if we had, say, 5 copies of it, then we draw 5 cards for each creature token that connects. Be careful when decking yourself though, since it's not a you may ability. As a bonus, it also gives us an unlimited hand size. Thought Vessel and Reliquary Tower are also included for that very reason as well. The deck can draw into a ton of cards, and neither of these really take up a slot on the deck since the former is a mana rock and the latter is a mana producing land, which also helps us keep our lands 100% singleton. Shimmer Dragon is another way to draw into a ton of cards. With so many artifacts in the deck, plus all the ways to create artifact tokens like treasures, gold, constructs, mirror, etc., is just more things we can tap down to draw cards. This dragon does a ton of work. Not only that, but it's a 5/6 flyer with potential hexproof, so it's also a great creature to copy and then turn all of our tokens into copies of. So we can also use it to smash face and potentially end the game. So good. Stroke of Genius and Drown in Dreams can also potentially draw into a ton of cards, but we gotta sink a lot of mana into them, which isn't that big of an issue in this deck. The most important thing is that they're easy to cast with just 1 blue mana plus their instants. With Drown in Dreams being a strict upgrade to Stroke of Genius, it also has the potential of disrupting an opponent by milling them for more than just a few cards. Idol of Oblivion, Skull Clamp, and War Room can also draw us cards, albeit not as massively as the previously mentioned ones. Skull Clamp needs no explanation to how amazing it can be, but if we're low in cards, we can just use it on any token with 1 toughness to draw 2 cards. If we have all of our tokens become copies of those, like the Prism token or Kobolds of Kirkkeep token, then we can draw into twice as many cards as the mana spent to equip through them. As for the epic mana generation, Storm the Vault is another way to create treasure tokens. Our creatures need to connect for it to happen though, and only once per opponent hit. However, the true use of this enchantment lies when it transforms into Vault of Katlakan, an upgraded Tolarian Academy. With the number of artifacts in the deck plus those it can create, this will transform into the vault without needing to use the enchantment to create any treasure at all. And then we can tap it down for insane amounts of blue mana. Phyrexian Altar can also be used to generate a ton of mana by sacrificing token creatures to it. This might seem counterproductive since we want to amass as many tokens as possible, but if we need the mana, we need the mana. As for generic mana production, Jeweled Lotus, Mox Opal, Mana Crypt, Mana Vault, Soul Ring, Talisman of Creativity, Arcane Signet, and Izzet Signet are included as the rest of the mana rocks of the deck. While I would leave it at that, keep in mind that the deck can also copy artifacts. So copying any of these mana rocks as well as the previously mentioned ones can really boost our mana production and get us very much ahead, especially considering that Brudiclad costs 6 to cast from the command zone the first time. The rest of the deck is just the rest of the lands. The deck's running Volcanic Island, Steam Vents, Volatile Fjord, Training Center, Sulphur Falls, Shivan Reef, Fiery Islet, Command Tower, Reflecting Pool, and Ancient Tomb, as well as 1 of each basic land type including snow-covered basics in order to have more basic lands without affecting Field of the Dead's efficacy. That way we can also have more fetchable lands. As with all of my deck techs, you don't have to run the more expensive mana sources like Volcanic Island, Mana Vault, Mana Crypt, Jewel Lotus, etc. if you don't already have them, won't proxy them, or aren't playing online. You can very easily swap them out for budget substitutes and the deck will still work just fine. If you do make any swaps for lands though, try and keep it singleton for Field of the Dead. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Brudiclad Telchor Engineer. Granted, this deck tech video is just showcasing the current version of my deck as of its recording, but hopefully you can get some ideas for it. I didn't purposely nerf this deck in the sense of forcibly not running powerful cards. There are some powerful cards peppered in the deck, but I wanted to build this deck as a fun deck that's more casual than your standard Brudiclad deck since it has a lot of pet cards. However, these cards don't present themselves as threats to your opponents at first glance. If they have to choose to spend their removal spell on 7 dwarves or something more pressing, chances are that your dwarves are safe, for now. If you're interested in the deck list of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. And if you want to see it live and in action, check out the gameplay video over on Neo Royal's YouTube channel. He recently invited me to play a match and this was the exact same deck I piloted. I'll put the link to that game in the description as well as at the end of this video. Definitely check out Neo Royal's YouTube channel for some amazing Commander gameplay content. I would also like to thank all my patrons for supporting me and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the Brewers, for their patronage. I'd also like to thank anyone using my TCG Player affiliate link. That also helps out the channel. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am the Bandit Kirby and happy brewing.